Henri Rousseau was the first artist to be labelled a modern primitive. Like other artists who attracted this label at the time, he was self-taught and only began to paint seriously late in life. Hitherto, he'd had to learn a living coming from a working class background as he did. Rousseau's father ran a tinware shop and later a tobacconist establishment when the tinware shop closed. So for Rousseau, painting was initially a spare time undertaking, though it would be wrong to label him a Sunday painter. Nevertheless, he'd had no formal training and never attained the technical standards the academies and salons demanded. For instance, in his portraits and landscapes, he seems to display very little knowledge of human anatomy and linear perspective. This resulted in continual ridicule by the establishment throughout his career. Yet towards the end of his life, he considered himself a great artist, certainly took himself very seriously as a painter, while others around him thought him simply self-delusionary. But what we have to ask ourselves about Rousseau is this: was his primitiveness or naivete, i.e. his childlike attempts at a representation of the real world, simply the result of a lack of technical skill, or was it a deliberate attempt to evolve a style which flouted the normal conventions of representational art? Whichever is your opinion at the close of this talk, he certainly paved the way forward to the Surrealist, Cubist, and avant-garde movements of the early 20th century and beyond. Now, this is one of his earliest paintings. You can see painted in 1879, horse-drawn cart in front of a mill. It's quite a small painting, only 13 by 22 inches. The quaint little figure and undersized horse and cart may indeed suggest a lack of formal training. And yet he must have seen for himself that the cart wheels aren't round, that the man pulling the horse is too big. In fact, the horse, cart, and man are disproportionate to each other. And being in the foreground, should have been painted much larger to make any sense of the mill and the mill race behind. This is a question we'll continually come back to, hoping to demonstrate that he deliberately sacrificed perspective and scale on the altar of composition, drama, and rich, very rich, vibrant color, not exemplified in this particular painting. As you can see, it's muted colors. But when we come on to the jungle paintings, they're extremely rich in color. Let's begin with some brief biographical details. Henri Rousseau was born in Laval in 1844. We know that as a young man, he was accused of pilfering money and postage stamps from the solicitor's office where he worked. To avoid jail, he joined the army and was imprisoned for a month anyway. When his father died 4 years later in 1868, he left the army at the age of 24 to support his mother, and they settled in Paris. The following year, he married his first wife, Clémence. They had 7 children, but only 2 survived infancy. It was not until 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, when he was again called up, incidentally, that he began to work at the city gates as a customs officer, earning him a lifelong sobriquet of Rousseau le douanier, Rousseau the customs officer. Now, he painted this painting of a typical toll gate. It might have been the actual one that he worked at. In fact, we've got to assume that it was probably. A very bright painting, as you can see, but something curious going on with these men. The one officer there might be realistically painted, but the one, what is this one doing on the roof there? Hard to see. and he's facing inland. And there's something going on here, and the gates look a little bit wonky to me too. But anyway, we can already see that he's attracted by very bright greens. He continued that work as a customs officer until 1893, when he retired on a small pension at his own request to pursue the career of a full-time professional painter. He was already 49, but he had been exhibiting regularly at the Salon des Indépendants for at least 8 years. This salon and the Salon des Refusés catered for work rejected by the official salon. It suited Rousseau well. He could at least have his work exhibited without too much negative comment. It may be surprising to learn that Rousseau was also an accomplished musician and supplemented his pension by giving violin and singing lessons. Despite the derision from the critics and virtually no success at the salons, Rousseau took himself very seriously as an artist, and by 1885 he was renting a studio in Paris. One of the 4 paintings he exhibited in 1886 was this one, A Carnival Evening. It already shows Rousseau's ability to convey a mood, though it has to be said his 2 bright figures look awkward. Where is the light source? Well, the moon is illuminating the 2 clouds up there, but the way the figures are painted, the light source should be in front of them, really. So again, conventions have been ignored. The figures seem, in fact, detached from the setting, as though superimposed, a cutout or a lithograph, perhaps. Their feet disturb the grass, not a jot. Nonetheless, the tracery of the winter branches under the moon is startling against the pastel pinks and blues of the dusk sky. The painting definitely has a lot going for it. Just let you look at that for a moment. It certainly made these 2 figures stand out, and they're very small as well. And notice the horizon is very low in this painting. It's just around about there, really. In the same year, Rousseau also exhibited A Walk in the Forest. Again, a smallish canvas. Although the vegetation is painted with aplomb, luxuriant, sharp colours, his trees might be labelled primitive in the extreme, with their carefully painted, sparse clumps of leaves tacked onto well-spaced branches. It's known that Rousseau has the habit of bringing leaves back to his home to paint. So there's very little attempt at realistically conveying leaves on a tree. But the whole painting is more a question of color and shape and form. And of course, the trees and the branches are very clearly defined. It could be argued that the woman is disproportionately small again, although maybe not. Among the paintings exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants in 1890 was this self-portrait landscape. No matter how much ridicule he had to bear, Rousseau thought of himself, as I've said, as a fine artist, and awarded himself the badge of the Palme Académique. I'll try that one again. Oh, I failed in that. Académique. Seen in his portrait. There is the palm. Although it was in fact awarded to another painter of the same name. So there was another Henri Rousseau painting at the same time, though he never achieved the fame that our Henri Rousseau did. So this is called a self-portrait landscape, and he's trying to combine self-portrait, there we are, with the landscape. And the extent to which he's succeeded or failed is the fact that he's just superimposed himself on the back. If he wasn't there, you might have a reasonable landscape there, I think, possibly. But he's totally disproportionately large, as you can see. Note the tiny figures on the quayside there. They belong to the landscape, and without him standing there like a huge giant, they might be reasonably drawn, painted. The Eiffel Tower had only just been erected the previous year, by the way, and you can just make it out there. So he's right up to the moment with his painting. Gauguin is said to have praised the richness of his blacks in this picture, in which everything is sharply outlined and finished. And he's actually painted the names of his two wives on his palette there, Clémence and Josephine. We come on to his wives later on. The first of his jungle pictures, for which Rousseau is, of course, well known, appeared in 1891, The Storm in the Forest. This is in the National Gallery in London. Here we have a rich, dense profusion of colour. The vegetation and branches of the trees swept dramatically from left to right by the storm. The sky, a dark, brooding lilac backdrop. The orange and reds suggesting flame, and in the midst of it all, a tiger creeps. You can well camouflaged, this tiger is. And if you'll notice, the tiger has a look of surprise on his face, and this painting originally was called Surprise. So you can only assume the tiger is surprised by the storm itself and is fearful of the forces of nature, bewildered by the forces of nature, shall we say. So there's a lot of movement in this painting, as you can see, from left to right, the storm sweeping the branches down. The branches, again, well defined. The leaves are not particularly well drawn, and the grasses are all in that same orientation as well. But there's tremendous amount of color there. The sky, this sort of lilac blue sky in the background, clashes well with the greens and the dark branches there, I think. So it's a very imposing canvas, I think you would say. Rousseau's first large exhibited canvas, painted in 1894, was this one called War, which hangs in the Louvre today. He based this on a lithograph produced for a novel called Le Tsar, and there is the lithograph which he copied. Rousseau has changed the rider into a demonic child with wild eyes and crazy hair, but you can see how faithful it is to the lithograph. The horse's appearance, we'll go back to the main painting. The horse's appearance, for all its anatomical quirkiness, suggests something of the apocalypse. And we have crows there picking out the eyes of some of the bodies on the floor. Very colourful painting again, quite a large painting too, measuring almost 4 foot by 6 foot. Although you'd think it was longer than that, looking at the painting. And the colours are very sharp, the shapes very well defined, the horse dark against these bright background, and then we've got the clouds, these fiery clouds in their various reds and oranges and pale lilacs. Rousseau manages to convey a cruel, reckless fury in this painting. The dead on the ground surely look forward to Stanley Spencer's Cuckham graveyard. Rousseau was not shy in reworking paintings by established artists. His Tiger Hunt, painted in 1897, was based on a painting by Rodolphe Ernst entitled Triumphal Evening. Now, I've only got a black and white version of that. I could only track a black and white version down, but you can quite clearly see how he's copied this painting in almost every detail. except that's the point, isn't it? He hasn't bothered to copy, or it hasn't interested him, let's put it that way, to copy the detail, so that, for argument's sake, this figure's clothing here, which in the original painting appears to have an awful lot of detail with regards to its folds and creases. This is far more simplified, the figure here, and then even the little still life, the box and the gun there, where it's far more jumbled up in the original. It's very, he's really pared it down to basic shapes, and you can see that clearly in his rock formation. The rock formation on the original, there's a serious attempt at creating a realistic rock formation there. With Rousseau's only interested in the basic shapes. He's not interested in creating a true representation. It's said that Rousseau was the only French painter of that time able to consistently work with success on large canvases. That said, we have to rationalize paintings done at this time, which were clearly problematic and fed the ridicule of the establishment. Boy on the Rocks. Now, what are we to make of this? There's little sense of realistic proportion, and yet he has made the figure somehow sinister in an overwhelming way. Well, I don't need to explain to you what is wrong with this painting from a purely representational point of view. We've only got to look at his legs, first of all, and the way he's been plonked, I think I use the word advisedly, plonked on top of these peaks, as though he must be, it could be almost be painful for him, I would have thought. And who this boy is, we don't know. But there's something captivating about this painting. Very dark clothing there. There's very little detail in the clothing, and that's, in fact, the whole figure is virtually black and white, and we've got these geometric lines on his undergarment there and his leggings. And again, he's almost like a cutout that's just been superimposed upon a rocky landscape. Or this, painted at roughly the same time, portrait of a woman. What are we to make of this tiny little kitten here playing with a ball of, I don't know what it is, wool, I suppose. Completely, the scale is completely wrong, isn't it? And do his leaves, I wonder, somehow recall William Morris wallpaper? I mean, the leaves now are simply patterns, really. They're very well defined. They're with spaces in between them. To what extent he was acquainted with the arts and crafts movement of Victorian Britain, we do not know. But there's some typical William Morris wallpaper, and you can see how his leaves are very similar. They're patterns. They're not. He's making no attempt to paint a leaf as we might see it in nature. He's just treating the basic shape of the leaf to make patterns and to make an attractive, colourful painting. That seems to be his idea. In both cases, the portraits are almost two-dimensional, as I mentioned before, like cardboard cutouts. They are so bizarre and ungainly, it is hardly surprising that his exhibits were placed in the least accessible rooms at every exhibition. Yet gatherings of people sought them out anyway, and from each one could often be heard gales of laughter. Most contemporary critics dismissed his work as hilarious and incompetent, though not all. Louis Roy, writing in the Mercure de France in 1895, wrote, and I quote, "It has been for Monsieur Rousseau as for all innovators. He proceeds from himself alone. He has the merit, rare today, of being absolutely personal. One would have to be of bad faith to dare to pretend that the man capable of suggesting ideas like these is not an artist. It has to be said his lines of perspective are not always convincing, as in this painting, House on the Outskirts of Paris in 1907. The road to the right of the building looks very odd indeed. Surely he must have been aware of this. Why didn't he correct it? Is it deliberate? If it is so, to what end, when he had already painted landscapes like this one, a view of Bièvre de Gentilly, which is fairly faithful representational painting, although again, being Rousseau, with very bright colors, brighter than you'd expect the trees and the forestry to be. But the perspective is fairly accurate in this painting, I think. Although again, we've got these just representational leaves on these writhing branches of the tree. And notice how again and again he paints, when he suggests the dark and light side of a trunk of a tree, there's no subtle fusing of the colors. On the dark side, it is dark, like the dark side of the moon, and on the light side, very light. So it makes for a very strongly visual image, I think, but it's not subtle. So where do we go from there? Ah, yes, the quarry. He seems to have perspective awry again in this painting, the quarry, painted at about the same time. Now, what is going on with this building, I fail to understand, to be perfectly honest. This piece of machinery here, it doesn't seem to be attached to anything particularly. It could be acting like a bridge between these two stacks of these pillars of bricks, or this brickwork. And what are these? We don't know. That's clearly a wall. And is the man in proportion? And look at the clouds. The clouds just stream across. He quite likes these sharp-edged clouds. And because he's using bright colors, he seems to be getting away with it, I think. It's a very colorful painting. On learning that, there might be a clue to his thinking in the following. On learning that a book was being prepared in 1895 on contemporary artists, Rousseau preempted his putative inclusion by turning up at the publisher with his own self-styled autobiography, which included these words written in the third person. And remember, Rousseau has written this. He has perfected himself more and more in the original manner he's adopted, and is becoming one of the best realist painters, believing that all liberty to create must be left to the inventor, whose thoughts are elevated to the beautiful and the good. Another clue came in 1910 when he wrote in a letter, "If I have preserved my naivety, it is because Monsieur Giraud, who is professor at the École des Beaux-Arts, and Monsieur Clément, director of the fine arts at the École de Lyon, told me to preserve it. And it has also been said of me that I am not of this century." That's a very interesting and significant remark to make, I think. Clearly, he thought he was ahead of his time, and it is that which probably helped him to withstand the ridicule of critics. When we project forward to figures like Chagall, Lowry, Stanley Spencer, or even Picasso, who was perhaps his greatest fan, we might understand this remark better. Henri Rousseau continued to draw inspiration from the suburbs of Paris. For instance, the Chair Factory. This is quite a small painting, 29 by 37. And it always reminds me of a painting by Hopper. I think it's the reds and against the creams and whites that do that. Notice his clouds again. He's got a definite style of clouds. They're definitely Rousseau clouds. But things are pretty much in proportion here until you see the fisherman down on the quayside there, who's tiny. And then we got these two figures here. Not quite sure what they are. We've got to assume they're figures, but they're tiny as well. Now, Rousseau must have seen that he painted them far too small, surely. And then the view of the Ile Saint-Louis, again a small painting, only 22 by 18, painted in 1888. And there's something very attractive about this painting as well. It's his sense of color, I'm sure, which recommends this painting. The dark blues of the river there against this very light raw sienna, mixed probably with some yellow ochre or even cream of the quayside. And then he's got some sharp detail in the background of various buildings and churches. That could be, I'm not quite sure my geography of Paris, but this could be Notre Dame, the facade of Notre Dame, possibly. And he's painted the bridge, some fine filigree, the ramparts of the bridge, which stand out, of course, against this very pale sky. Now, we're not sure, is that the sun or the moon? It's not entirely sure. This could be early evening, maybe, or it could be sometime in the daytime. Hard to say. But when we view a painting like Sleeping Gypsy, we see Rousseau as a complete master of his own individual style. Rousseau described the painting thus: a wandering negress, a mandolin player, lies with her jar beside her, a vase with drinking water, overcome by fatigue in a deep sleep. A lion chances to pass by, picks up her scent, yet does not devour her. There is a moonlight effect, very poetic. Those are Rousseau's own words. Dreamlike in mood, but with heavy contrasting and subtle tones, does this painting not point forward to the Surrealist movement? Is Rousseau already painting in the 20th century? I leave you to look at that a moment. It's very colorful painting, very startling, but the subject matter is strange and weird in the extreme. And look at the patterning, the colors, the stripes colors of the gypsies' clothes. No attempt at shading. Well, very little attempt. There is a dark underside to her clothes there, but and the stick sort of hangs awkwardly there. The perspective of the stick doesn't seem right. In fact, the perspective of the mandolin, that's again, it almost looks as though it's superimposed, like a cutout of a mandolin, rather than actually lying alongside the gypsy. After the death of his first wife, Clémence, Rousseau took his 12-year-old daughter to live with his brother and sister in Angers. The only other child of that marriage, a son, had died in 1887 at the age of 18. In 1899, at the turn of the century, Rousseau married the widow Josephine. He depicted her in the painting The Present and the Past. Notice the heads in the clouds. It's not known who the heads are. The most likely explanation is that they are the two departed spouses, but it's also been suggested that they are younger versions of Rousseau and his wife Josephine. Josephine herself dies 3 years later, incidentally. Rousseau's pension barely supported him, and he had to supplement his meagre earnings from his work. He was forced to accept jobs as an interior decorator and sign writer from time to time. He had business cards printed calling himself artiste peintre décorateur, and began to acquire his canvases and paint on credit, quickly falling into debt and finding himself in court. In desperation, he started to give private painting and music lessons in his studio, putting a plaque outside which read, "Lessons in Elocution, Music, Painting and Singing." A typically naive painting of that period was The Girl with the Doll. Let you look at that a moment. It's very typical of Rousseau, as you can see. It harks back to the boy sitting on the mountaintop. It's very two-dimensional. No attempt at a representational portrait, of course. And the legs are awkward there, aren't they? And quite what the background is there, we don't know. They're just patterns, colored patterns. He's painted her with a frown. Perhaps she's frowning at her own portrait, I don't know. Also, Young Girl in Pink, which is a portrait of a neighbor's child, Charlotte Papouin. How faithful that is to Charlotte, we don't know. Her family had shown Rousseau many kindnesses throughout his times of poverty, had shared their meals with him, and he gave them this picture in gratitude. I hope they were grateful for it. The most he ever received for a painting was 300 francs for this painting, Tu fais Baby, painted in 1903. It boasts bold, contrasting areas of clear colour, and again points the way to Surrealism, or perhaps the early works of de Chirico. Again, very colourful. The leaves, typically Rousseau leaves there, well defined and well spaced out so that they're more patterns than leaves. And look at the flowers in the girls or babies. Well, she's holding her item of clothing up, a vest or whatever it is, and she's got them in there while at the same time dangling this jester puppet at the same. It's quite a large painting, 40 by 32, and he managed to sell it. The next painting was done in lieu of a grocery bill owed to a local shopkeeper, the Carte of Père Junier. This is in the Louvre. It was done from a photograph which still exists and is actually still splattered with paint. The perspective of the spokes and the dogs is clearly problematic, but the composition and colour tones of the painting work well. So what they thought about this painting, I don't know. It's not recorded. Hopefully they recognize themselves. This character here is completely out of proportion to the rest of the people in the cart. And what is this? What's going on with this sort of paved area or flagged area? We don't know. And why did he paint that dog so tiny? There are similar problems with a country wedding painted in 1905, which again is taken from a photograph, though it doesn't appear to have been a commission or painted in gratitude of some charitable service done to him. And it's not surprising that the great painters or the great paint critics of the day we'd look at that and say, well, a child could have painted that, or a child probably has painted it, because there's no attempt at making it look realistic. And yet he considered himself to be a painter of realism. The bride seems to be floating in air, as you can see. And the dog, although it's nearer to the painter than the rest of the crowd, the formation, is larger, but perhaps too large. And this character here, the granny and granddad, who I take to be the elderly generation, they seem to be a little bit too small. But there we are, we're getting used to Rousseau's paintings now. The beginning of a general appreciation of Rousseau's work among the avant-garde artists of the day seems to date from this year, 1905, with his paintings exhibited in the salons, including this one in the newly formed Salon d'Automne, the lion being hungry. Now we're starting to come on to Rousseau's jungle paintings. It's a large painting, measuring 6'6" by 10 foot. It was reproduced in the catalogue alongside works by Cézanne, Matisse, and Derain, and this one was sold for 200 francs. It was the first painting of Rousseau's to be bought by a dealer. So again, we've got the jungle scene of the lion attacking some sort of animal here. It's not clear what sort of animal that is. And then we've got another leopard or jaguar. It wouldn't be a jaguar, right? It's hard to decide what this. So let's call it a leopard crawling up the branch of a tree. And then we've got a bird sitting there in front of a very red sun. But the first thing that hits you about this painting are the leaves, of course. The leaves are all painted separately, well-defined colors. They stand out. And the grass is on the right there. And all against this light, very light blue sky. And there's quite a bit of detail, actually, in fairness to Rousseau, with the grass. If you look at the bottom of the painting, there's quite a lot of detail there. An attempt to make grass look fairly realistic, though that obviously wasn't his interest particularly. Apollinaire was introduced to Rousseau by Alfred Jarry, and he subsequently became a warm admirer of Rousseau's work. The other great enthusiast for Rousseau was Picasso. What he and others took from this work was the extraordinary effect Rousseau achieved while ignoring visual conventions. He once told Picasso, "We are the two great painters of the age." Quite a bold statement. The high point of his new recognition was perhaps a famous banquet Picasso gave in his honor in 1908 in Picasso's studio. The latter had picked up one of Rousseau's paintings from a second-hand shop for 5 francs and used it as a cause for celebration. It's believed to be this one, Portrait of a Woman. The guests included Apollinaire, Max Jacob, and Gertrude Stein. Braque was there too, playing his accordion, and the celebration was hailed an unqualified success, except that after waiting for several hours for dinner to arrive, Picasso remembered he made the mistake of ordering it for the next day. The following year, Rousseau exhibited his portrait of Apollinaire, the muse inspiring the poet. The general opinion was that it bore absolutely no resemblance to the poet, yet everyone seemed to know who it was. But it was the jungle pictures which ultimately brought Rousseau the recognition he craved. There was always something going on in these jungles, where the definition of every aspect of vegetation was crisply outlined and boldly colored. Most of the animals seem to be based on illustrations from a book found in Rousseau's studio after his death. The book was called Bêtes Sauvages, but why he was drawn to paint these pictures is not known. This one is called Scouts Attacked by a Tiger, and there is the poor scout being attacked by a not a very convincingly painted tiger, I don't think. It's typical with its vibrant color and textures and drama, of course. Rousseau was interested in drama. And again, we've got the lead. It's quite a dark background there, so that the tiger stands out. And then here we've got a scout, he calls them scouts, another scout on a horse being frightened by the attack. So there's a lot of drama going on in this painting. The only place there's no drama going on is in the leaves, that are just like bystanders there, disinterested or uninterested bystanders. It's thought a photograph of a caged jaguar playing with its keeper was used as a basis for this painting, Negro Attacked by a Jaguar. So the actual photograph he used, the Negro was playing with the jaguar, rather unwisely, I'd have thought, but he's used it as though the jaguar is attacking the keeper or the native in the jungle. In 1907, he produced this dark, moody painting, The Snake Charmer. This you'll find in the Louvre, quite a large painting again, 5.5 foot by 6 foot. It was a commission by the painter Delaunay's mother as an aide memoir of a visit to India. And we're certainly getting towards a stylized technique, are we not? Look at these reeds here, for argument's sake, very stylized, and nothing particularly done in proportion. The leaves, we don't, unrecognizable, the vegetation. Notice this snake there. The snakes, he's charming, this snake charmer is charming several snakes. He's got a snake around his neck and a snake coming out of the grass there and another one going there. But this bird here, I don't think it's a flamingo, but it's pink anyway. Seems to be unworried about all the snakes. And we got a bird up in the tree there as well. You just make out his red plumage, his dark red plumage. I'm not sure there isn't another one there too. In Merry Jesters, painted in 1906, a triangle of monkeys are seen playing with a milk bottle, there's the milk bottle, and a back scratcher, curiously, while some sort of exotic bird looks on. So now we're starting to get elements of surrealism impinging themselves, in so much as the choice of these objects, the back scratcher and the upturned milk bottle, incongruous, completely incongruous within the context of a jungle, I would have thought. Let you look at that for a moment. Again, look at the fronds on the shrubs at the background here. Everyone painted individually. Every frond painted individually against a dark background. I'm not sure what this plant is, but then again, it's not up to us to try and identify the plants. The lush vegetation is even more surrealist in this painting, woman walking in an exotic forest. And look at the scale of the items in these huge blue flowers here, blooms here, and the fruit, the orange and red fruits. They well could be oranges or peaches, we don't know, dotted about in the trees, and this minuscule woman walking in this exotic forest. It's dreamlike. because of the scale, it's dreamlike. And he's gone to some trouble to paint the grasses at the bottom here with a very, very fine paintbrush. And the colours work well, I think. The blue against the reds and the oranges, and of course the various greens. In this one, exotic landscape, a monkey is eating an orange while two others swing on a tree, sending down more fruit. There they are. This is the one eating the fruit, and there's another monkey hidden in the grass here with his, you can just see his hands catching the fruit. The monkeys playfully are shaking the tree so that they can eat the fruit. An amusing painting, I think you'll agree. Delightful painting, really. The differences in scale of leaves, which maintain an unnatural uniform shape, and the eccentric animals in these pictures, in defiance of the laws of perspective, create a dreamlike world, which again appealed to the Surrealists. And I'd also say as well, we have to remember that the Fauve movement, although it was very short-lived, it was the time of the Fauve movement as well, and you remember that they were particularly interested in bright colours and particularly interested in colour for its own sake. This one is called Flamingos, even more stylized and disdainful of proper scale, rich in colour and beautifully composed. It somehow seems to work well. If this is a peaceful scene, then the next picture is all the drama of tooth and claw, fight between tiger and buffalo. So we've had a similar paint, we've just seen a similar painting to this. And there's a water buffalo there, and this looks more like a tiger to me. Drama again in the jungle with the leaves, just you can't say the leaves are a background. There's as much part of this painting as the tiger and the water buffalo, I think, but drama in the jungle. But it was not all jungle pictures at this time. Rousseau was still painting Parisian suburbs. This is a view of Malakoff. Typical of Rousseau, in so much as perspective doesn't bother him too much, and scale, these figures are far too small, surely. And we've got quite a stormy sky there, which is unusual for Rousseau. He seems to like plain skies or clouds tearing across, streaking across in streaks, themselves painted in streaks. And then here we have a still life, flowers in a vase, quite a small one, 18 by 13. Again, two-dimensional, no attempt at shadowing, shading to show the light source. There is no light source, unless it's right, it's coming from the front. And again, still life, painted in 1910, against small again, 15 by 18. I think of some of Picasso's early still lifes when I see this painting. Just the forms are painted, very little attempt to give any sort of perspective or any sort of three-dimensional effect with shadowing. Sadly and ironically, it was about this time that Rousseau's naivete extended to his business matters. He was duped by a fellow musician into opening a bank account under a false name, with money given to him by his supposed friend, who'd taken advantage of his credulity. When the fraud was discovered, Rousseau was arrested and held on remand. When the case came to court, he was fined and given a suspended prison sentence. We're told Rousseau told the judge, "I will paint your wife." I don't know whether he actually did. To add to his despair, this time he fell in love with a 54-year-old woman, Leonie. Remember, he'd been widowed twice. Her father opposed the relationship on the grounds that Rousseau painted absurd pictures and had a police record. Nothing came of the liaison other than perhaps a sensuality which crept into his painting, as in this last exhibited picture, The Dream. Rousseau explained this painting thus: the woman sleeping on the couch dreams that she is transported into the forest, hearing the notes of the snake charmer's pipe. Don't be astonished to find, and this is Rousseau writing, don't be astonished to find a couch in a virgin forest. It is only there for the richness of the red. Now then, there surely is a huge clue as to what is going on with Rousseau in his painting. He's not interested in painting realistic landscapes or canvases. He's interested in the colors. So if he wants a red couch, if he wants to paint a red couch, however unreasonable it would be to find a red couch in a jungle with these animals here bearing down on it, and this snake charmer again in the background, that's what he does. And this, of course, surely suggests and leads easily into the Surrealist movement and the Dada movement as well. Rousseau died in that same year, 1910, from gangrene. His funeral was attended by only 7 people. Leonie did not attend. He was buried in a pauper's grave, and the paintings in his studio were sold off by his friends to pay for his funeral. His body was, however, reinterred 2 years later with a headstone and a poem by Apollinaire. A rough translation of this, and it's not my translation, I hasten to add, of this poem reads: "We greet you, gentle Rousseau. You hear us, Delaunay, his wife, Monsieur Quaval, and I. Let your baggage pass free through heaven's gate," reference to his former job as a customs officer, of course. "We'll bring you brushes, paints, and canvases so that you can devote your sacred leisures in the real light to painting, as you did my portrait, painting the face of the stars." And it's signed Willem Apollinaire, 1912. However, in 1947, his remains were transferred yet again to his hometown in Laval. So what are we to conclude of Henri Rousseau's work? That it painted the way towards important art movements of the 20th century, though perhaps by default. That he was self-delusional regarding his own importance as a painter, though Picasso and others certainly recognized he had plenty to offer the world of art. That whether his paintings are considered naive or not, he was on occasion certainly naive in his dealing with his fellow man, and barely scraped a living from his work. Well, naive or not, I'll leave you with this fact to ponder. At Christie's in 2009, this painting, Happy Quartet, painted in 1902, realized just under $3 million.